Well, I guess we should get started. Let's see. Oh, yeah. About 20 of us are here. Good evening and welcome to our Zoom presentation. My name is Lynn Clark. I'm the Executive Director of the Warner Historical Society. I'd like to welcome you to our 11th annual Torrey Hill Authors Series. We're pleased to have author Joel Christian Gill with us this evening. One quick housekeeping announcement. Please be sure your microphones are on mute. You will have an opportunity to ask questions after Joel's presentation is finished. This event could not take place without our faithful sponsors and advertisers. Our Authors Circle sponsors this year are Pelletieri Associates and the Nancy Sibley Wilkins Town of Warner Trust Fund of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. Our Reading Circle sponsors are Brown Family Realty and Greenleaf Irrigation. Many of our sponsors and advertisers have supported this series from the beginning, and we hope that you will support the businesses and museums you see listed in your program booklet. I would also like to extend a thank you to Catherine Nevins from our local independent bookstore, Main Street Bookends. She helps me identify and contact the authors this year. Catherine has the books written by the presenters from this series at the bookstore, and she offers curbside pickup. Upcoming events for the Warner Historical Society include a talk on July 16th at 7 p.m. by Rebecca Corser and myself, titled Hotels, Boarding Houses, and Summer Visitors. This is the last talk in our series about the railroad era in Warner. Email the office for a Zoom link. And of course, the three remaining Torrey Hill programs, Susan Ware on July 25th, Bern Heinrich on August 8th, and Rebecca and Addie Rule on August 22nd. Tickets are available through our website. Sadly, the barn sale is not open for browsing. However, items for sale are now posted on our Facebook page, and volunteers are always willing to help locate specific items for you. And finally, why a writer series in Warner, New Hampshire? Warner has had and continues to have a rich tradition of writers and artists living here. In fact, in the 19th century, Warner had over 97 published writers. A program featuring authors seemed like a natural fit. So where did the name Torrey Hill come from? On the road to Mount Kearsarge is a long, steep hill historically known as Torrey Hill, and near the top on the right is located a large boulder. In 1773, Mr. William Barker erected a small building near this rock. Oral history says that either Mr. Barker or someone who stayed with him was a British spy and had important papers hidden in the house. The papers were never found, and over time, the rock's profile had the brow and the nose that gave it human characteristics and the name Old Torrey, and over time, the road was upgraded, the profile was altered. But our logo, beautifully created by Rick Hedrick, is based on photographs of what the profile looked like. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first author of this year's series, Joel Christian Gill. Gill is a cartoonist and historian who speaks nationally on the importance of sharing stories. He wrote the words and drew the pictures in Fast Enough, Bessie Stringfield's first ride, published by Lion Forge in 2019. And the award-winning graphic novel series Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, as well as Tales of the Talented Tenth from Fulcrum Publishing. He has worked for diverse clients, including the People's United Party of Belize, NBC, the Boston Globe, and has written for the Huffington Post. His latest work is a memoir chronicling how children deal with abuse and trauma, titled Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence. He was chair of foundations and then comic arts at the New Hampshire Institute of Art. He is currently an associate professor of illustration at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. Gill has dedicated his life to creating stories to build connections with readers through empathy, compassion, and ultimately humanity. He received his MFA from Boston University and his BA from Roanoke College. And now I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to Joel. hopefully.
I'll share my screen in a second. I'm just gonna say hello to everybody. And then I'm going to, what I'll do is I'm going to give a little artist talk about how I got here. And then I'm going to read from Fights, my newest graphic novel, which is this one here. And that's me circa 1991 on the cover. Just a trigger warning for anybody. There's a lot of cursing in this book and a lot of sexual abuse and trauma, and so I'm going to read from a section in that. So I just want to give you all a heads up before I get there, and I'm going to share my screen and get started. Oh, you got to give me the opportunity to share it.
Right. So that's what I have to figure out how to do that again.
So another thing I learned while doing all of these Zoom things is that if you want to clap, since nobody can, you can't really clap now, you can do the sign language, the American Sign Language clapping. So when you don't have to do this, you can actually do this, and that's clapping. So like one of the things you can do so that you don't have to because I know it's like fumbling for that little button, like how do I hit that reaction button so that I can put the little clapping up there? You could just do this and everybody will know. Like just keep everybody in the know, I would say.
So try it now, Joel.
Okay. All right, gotcha. So let's go to Keynote. And everybody should see that. Should be a picture of me, right? Just you can shake your hand and do this because I can see some of you. Thank you for having me. I am incredibly grateful to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I am much more enthusiastic. I mean, I guess I'm much more charismatic in person than I am on a screen. But also, like, you can still talk to me. But so I started life in a little small town in southwestern Virginia called Rocky Mount. So Rocky Mount's got a couple of claims, like it's in a place called Franklin County, Virginia, and it has a couple of claims to fame. And one of those claims to fame is that Franklin County is the moonshine capital of the world. That's their claim. That's one of their claim to fame. And they're also the hometown of Jubal Early, who was one of the progenitors of the Lost Cause, the movement after the Civil War to actually change the formulation of how we thought about the PR campaign that actually changed it. This little town, which was about 5,000 people, had two housing projects, one on one side and one on the other. You can't really see where this was, but on the other side, like if you look to the left, that's where Candlewood was, which is where I'm from. And I grew up in Candlewood, and we moved there from Martinsville, Virginia, which is where I was born. Its only claim to fame is racism and racetracks, because you probably all heard of Martinsville Speedway. But we moved to Rocky Mount, which is my mom's hometown, and this was about 1980. And in 1980, my father died. And he died under very suspicious circumstances on a boating accident. This is actually one of the only pictures I have of me and him together. And for some reason, my grandmother thought that it would be a good idea to take some pictures of me by his coffin. So these are the only pictures I have of me and my dad. And what subsequently happens, I don't know if you've dealt with children who have dealt with loss in such a way that I did, you realize that they just become angry. And I became angry as a kid. And also, I was also like a liar. This is when I became a storyteller. And when I say liar, it's really about like the idea that I would tell stories about the person that I wanted people to see. And that usually manifested itself as like how many He-Man action figures I had. And when I talk to kids, typically I tell them, when I talk to anybody, I say He-Man in 1985 was the Pokemon of 1985. You had to get them all. There were all different types of He-Mans. There was Castle Grayskull, which is in the background, and there was, you know, all these different kinds, which I have. You can probably see I have most of this stuff in the background, but in 1985, I was too poor to have any of it. But I would tell people, because people would go outside and they would play, and I would go outside to try to play with these kids, and they would say, "Where are your He-Man action figures?" And I would always tell them that they were at my grandma's house. I would, like, if they said, "Did you have Castle Grayskull?" I'm like, "It's at my grandma's house." "Do you have Wind Raider?" "It's at my grandma." Like, any of the He-Man figures, I had them all, but they were all at my grandma's house. And so like, I became angry, I became a liar and a storyteller, and I also became the scourge of the neighborhood. Like, this is something that like, I was a bully. I like beat up other kids. I was like the kid that some kids used to tell me that they had nightmares about. Like, I had people tell me, like, "I had nightmares about you." But also, like, this was a kid who was like, I was a kid who was dealing with a lot of trauma and abuse at the time. And so I went through this. I went through school like this. And in second grade, I encountered Miss Norton. Miss Norton. So in college, I had to write a paper about how I would rearrange the gates of hell. Like, if I had to rearrange the gates of hell, the circles of hell, how would I do that? And the inner circle of hell was actually guarded by Miss Norton. The entrance of hell was guarded by various ex-girlfriends, but the inner circle of hell was guarded by Miss Norton. But if she's not burning in hell, it's because she really taught me to love reading. And when I started to read comics. Comics and like a lot of Judy Blume books. I actually have an original copy of Tales of the Fourth Grade Nothing that I had when I was a kid, that I loved that book. And so, but comics were the thing. Comics were good because I could buy like a big comic, like a Cracked or a Mad, and I'd have lots of different stories in them, and I would keep it for a long time because I didn't have money to get them all the time. But the library was where I spent a lot of my time. And so I spent a lot of time really being involved in like comics. So as I got older, I decided that I wanted to draw comics. That's what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a cartoonist. And I went to college, and that wasn't, they didn't have any, there was no comics programs at the time, or very few illustration programs. And so I went into graphic design. And in the process of doing this graphic design degree, I decided I was going to be a painter. But this is an interesting story that I don't tell every time, but I'll tell you this one. So I went to college. I went to high school, and in high school, there was one class that I needed to take in order to graduate. And I didn't take it because there was some girl that at a different school that I spent more time at her school skipping classes. And so they wanted me to come back for an entire year and take that one class. And I decided not to. I was like, I'm not going to do that. That's not going to be something that I do. And so I like basically dropped out of high school. I spent a year working. And then eventually, like a year after working for a year at like various like jobs and manufacturing and other places, I got married. My wife was pregnant with my daughters, and I decided to go back to college. And so in Virginia at the time, because there was a program to like incorporate coal miners and people who like had lost jobs for manufacturing back into the society, they were letting you go to college without a high school diploma. You could just go if you were 18 and if you were over 18 and you were not like living at home. And I wasn't, because I was married. So I got into that. I slid into that sort of segment. So I go to college, take the graphic design program, get really involved in painting, decide that that's what I want to do, not comics and not tell stories, but I want to be a painter. And so I go to get my 2-year associate's degree in commercial art. And then I applied to Roanoke College. I got into Roanoke College because I had good grades in community college. I got in, I got scholarship. A week before classes started, they came to me and they called me and they said, "Joel, we need your high school diploma." And I said, "I don't have a high school diploma." I said, I have an associate's degree. I have a college degree. And they were like, "We need a high school diploma. We can't let you in without a high school diploma." And I was like, I don't know what to do. They were like, well, I can't go to GED classes because that's 6 weeks. And they were like, why don't you go to the night school? So Tuesday night, I went to the night school and drove in this broken down station wagon that my wife's grandfather had given us. And my daughters were in the back. They were babies. They were like 2. And my son and my wife was in the front. And so I go into the night school and I talked to the principal. His name was Mr. Ball, and I'll never forget him. I'll never forget his face and his name for the rest of my life. He looks at my transcripts. I had like a 3.7 GPA at community college, and he goes, "There's not really anything we can give you. So how about we just give you a test?" And I'm like, "I'll take that." He said, "So world history?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I know history. I could do this, right?" Didn't give me a book, doesn't give me anything. He just sends me away. Come back next week on Tuesday. It was actually less than that. It was like 6 days. Come back in 6 days and we'll give you a test. So I go back in 6 days, and the proctor for the test was my high school English teacher, Mr. Powell, who was like the coolest teacher because like everybody was wearing these pants called skids, and he was a teacher. He was white, but he would wear skids, and everybody's like, he's the coolest teacher, right? So Mr. Powell was like, like moonlighting at this at the night school. So he gives me the test, and I take the test, confident that I've done well. And Mr. Powell comes back in and he gives me back the test, and he goes, "Joel, now that you've seen some of the wrong answers, let's see if you can find some of the right ones." So he gives me back the test, and I take the test again, and he comes back in. So I take the test again, thinking I don't know, they didn't give me a book or anything. They just said, "Here, go, take a test." So he comes back in with Mr. Ball, and he leans up against the table and he goes, "Joel, do you need to impress Roanoke College to get in, or do you just need a grade, a diploma?" I said, "I just need a diploma." And he turns to Mr. Ball and he says, "Just give him the damn diploma." And that's how I got my high school diploma. So then I went to Roanoke College. I was a star student at Roanoke College, and then I got a full ride to Boston University. I had only ever lived in Southwest Virginia at the time. And so I moved to BU. And this is a picture of Boston. And I discovered something that I did not realize I would discover above the Mason-Dixon line, and that is racism. Did y'all know that racism exists above the Mason-Dixon line too? Not only in the South, it actually happens all over the country. One of the things we used to do when we were there is we ever knew where we lived. We didn't know much about the city, and I had 4 kids. And so if we got lost, we would just follow the Citgo sign because we lived right near there on BU's campus. And while I was at BU, I did a lot of paintings of my family. I became very insular and inward focused, and I didn't spend a lot of time looking at the world around me. It was more about my wife and my kids. And so this is my wife and my 3 daughters. My youngest daughter is at the top. My son is on the right-hand side. And so it was just all about these paintings about my family. When I left Boston, because BU was great. I love the school. I give money every year. I love it. I will tell anybody to go there. The people are fantastic. But I left really focused on family and not living in a city with 4 kids, because it was, as you can imagine, really difficult. And I came back thinking about the racism that I had experienced in Boston, and it was very subtle. It wasn't I didn't have Klansmen when my town in southwestern Virginia. I had Klansmen walk. We had Klan march in the town in 1985 when I was 10 years old. But I was drawing caricatures in Boston at Faneuil Hall, and there was a guy who came in. It was my first year there, and he was he says to me, where are you from? He's from Virginia. He was oh, you're a black man, and I got to teach you about Boston. And he starts telling me all these things not to do, don't go to this neighborhood, stay out of that neighborhood, make sure you don't go there with your white wife, and was telling me all these things that I should be afraid of about Boston. And then I was in the MFA, and there was a security guard who let me into a show because he heard my accent. He was black, and he let me in the show because I reminded him of some woman he dated in 60 years ago or whatever, right, from the South. And he says, when I came out, he goes, I'm born and raised in Boston, but I'll never be a Red Sox fan. And he pulled out this article, this laminated article that he carried around in his pocket that was explaining how the Red Sox had been a racist organization and how the manager wouldn't even go and look at Hank Aaron, I think, wouldn't even consider him because he didn't want to sit around waiting for some nigger. And he said he would never, and like told me these things. And it was really sort of striking that this was like, I grew up in this small Southwestern Virginia town where there was a Klan march that was the home of Jubal Early. And I moved to this bastion of liberalism and like where some of the first abolitionist newspapers were, and one of the first states to abolish slavery. And now I'm discovering this racism. And it got me thinking about how being a Black man and being in love with the South, because I really love the South. I think the South is really like, if I could retire right now, I'd go and live on a beach in the South somewhere. And, but being in love with the South is kind of like falling in love with a sex worker. There's just some things you just don't talk about. And so that's kind of how I felt about it. And I started thinking about what that means because I went back to the South because I'd been sort of beaten by Boston for the 2 years that I was here. And I started thinking about, I'd been doing these research on these lynching paintings, this really bad lynching that happened in Virginia. And I was going to do some paintings based on it, but I got to the middle of the night and decided I couldn't do it. So I stopped doing it. And then I picked it back up when I went back to Virginia, and I did some paintings based on the lynchings. But a friend of mine looked at those paintings and said, Joel, your paintings are trying to tell stories and they're failing. And at that point, I started thinking about how I originally wanted to be a storyteller. And at the same time, I heard this story. I saw this thing on NPR about Chris Ware, who was an amazing cartoonist. He's one of the only cartoonists to ever win the Guardian Prize for Literature. And he was telling stories, and the stories were really interesting. They weren't superheroes. They were different. And I thought, so comics can be something else. So I started doing some paintings that sort of would use this idea of the language of comics, but they started to fail too. And so then I went and got myself a library degree. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with a library degree, but a library degree is when you have a will and a determination and a library card. And you just go to the library and you learn as much as you can about something. And so I did, and I started looking up. I found Winsor McKay, who was one of my favorite cartoonists, who did Little Nemo and Slumberland, Joe Sacco, among others, so many more, Frank King, Gasoline Alley, Will Eisner, who drew The Spirit, and then of course all of the classic comic book artists who drew Marvel and DC. But I ran across this cartoonist named Box Brown, who we're about the same age, and he was just doing really interesting comics at the time. I just found him. I found his website just by going down a rabbit hole, and so I was cyber stalking him. And I don't know if you've ever cyber stalked somebody, but you just put their name in Google and see what happens, right? And so I came Box Brown, and Box Brown, his name is Brian, was a white kid in Philadelphia. So I knew he wasn't this enslaved African who mailed himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia to escape from slavery to freedom. And so I sent him an email. Why are you, this white kid from Philadelphia, why do you have this name of this enslaved African? And he said, well, my friends call me Box because I'm square shaped. But someday I might do a story about that guy. And I said, that's a fantastic idea. I'm going to steal your story. And so I stole his idea, and I did the story of Henry Box Brown, which was a really good way to sort of try to start drawing comics when you already had a set sort of thing that you had to figure out. And then once I did that story, people started telling me other stories. And they told me about, Harry Bucky Lou, who was the first Black basketball player who played in the league in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1902. And I was doing these little mini comics. These basically, I'd go to Kinko's, fold them up, and sell these little mini comics at shows. Around about that time, I got an email from this guy from London, and he was working for the People's United Party of Belize. And he said, I want you to do some work for us. And I said, this sounds like a Nigerian scam letter. He was like, well, can I call you? And I sent him my telephone number, and this British guy calls me, and he's like, we found your comics, this little $2 comic that I was selling at shows across the country, individually. And he said, yeah, we want to see if you can do some work for us. So for the next 8 weeks, I did $30,000 worth of work for the People's United Party of Belize. I did comics, I redesigned money, and I redesigned their money so they could put it in the comic book to with Dean Barrow on the cover. I did all of these things over the course of about 6 weeks. It was the best Christmas ever. That was the first. I got a trip to London. It was amazing. And on the night of the election, the political operative was actually writing the acceptance speech for the new prime minister of Belize. And I was going to be invited to a state dinner in Belize, which would have been so dope, but then they lost. And I can never go to Belize because I spent 8 weeks making fun of a third world country's prime minister's family. So I'm banned from Belize, so I can never actually go there. But that was like a really good thing that happened because of comics. And so I just came back home. This was about the time that I went digital too. And I started drawing more comics. And I did the story of Major Taylor, who was called the Black Cyclone, who was the first Black American world champion in any sport. He was a cyclist. In 1899, he won 7 world records. So I had another mini comic. I was selling them. And about this time, my publisher, Fulcrum, showed up. And they said, we would really love to publish these books. And I was like, that would be really great. And they said, when we were doing the process, they were like, who would you like to have to write the foreword? I said, it would be great if we could get Skip Gates to write the foreword. And I was like, that's my pie in the sky. Like, how do I get a hold of Skip Gates? And so we were trying all these different ways until finally I put it on Facebook. I'm like, does anybody know Skip Gates? And then a couple of things came up. I went to high school with his niece and didn't know it, in Southwestern Virginia. And there was a figure model at NHIA when I was working there who knew a producer who worked with them. And so they sent me his email. And I sent him an email, basically the same email I sent to his Harvard email that just bounced back. Like, I get thousands of emails every day. I can't answer them all. I sent it to this new email, and he responded immediately, like in 5 minutes. Love to write the book for you, Joel. My publisher was actually in the process of writing another letter. And anyway, so Skip wrote the foreword to it. Seen him, met with him a number of times since then. He's really, really great. And then in the process, I wanted to do more stories, so Strange Fruit is an anthology. This book has a lot of stories. It has I think 8 or 9 stories in it. And I wanted to flesh out and do a much broader narrative about one individual. And I had drawn about a story about Bass Reeves, who was the most successful lawman in the Old West. And a lot of historians believe that he was the original inspiration for the Lone Ranger because he was, he was a lone marshal out in this place called the Deadline. He had a Native American sidekick. He would leave a silver dollar behind because he couldn't read or write. He would dress in disguises. He did all of these things. And so people think, well, maybe he was the Lone Ranger. I don't think he actually was the inspiration for the Lone Ranger. I just think it's such a coincidence that he actually did all of the things that the Lone Ranger did. And so I did a story for him, and I knew this was going to be a series. So it was Tales of the Talented Tenth. Is based on an essay by W.E.B. Du Bois about this Black intellectual class that would rise up and bring the rest of them. I mean, he called them the Talented Tenth. And so I decided to do a series called The Talented Tenth in conjunction with Strange Fruit. And then one of the criticisms that Strange Fruit Volume 1 got, and which was just like some random people online saying that I was misogynist because I had left women out of Strange Fruit Volume 1, which is true. I did leave women out. And I always tell people that's just what male privilege is, not having to think about women in this situation. So in order to combat that, you don't yell, I'm not misogynist. You say, this is how I can be anti-misogynist, right? Like the same thing with anti-racist. It's like, you can't be not misogynist. You have to be anti. And so in that sense, I was like, I'm going to make sure that I seek out stories about Black women. now to show that's what we should be talking about anyway. So I did a story about Bessie Stringfield, who was the first Black woman to crisscross the United States on a motorcycle. She did it eight times, and she did all of this stuff in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So she drove all through the Jim Crow South when women weren't supposed to be doing anything, let alone Black women who weren't supposed to exist. And so I did this story about Bessie. And since then, I've had like a book. I've only been 1 year in the last 6 years that I haven't published a book. And so I went right into Strange Fruit Volume 2, which has a lot of women in it. Like, it has the story of Millie and Christine McCoy, who were called the Two-Headed Nightingale, who were conjoined twins, who traveled the United States. It has one of my favorite characters, my favorite all-time characters in history, Stagecoach Mary Fields, who was the first woman mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. She had a star route, which is the scariest route you could have as a postal worker because it was dangerous. And she did it by being she won it by being the fastest person to hitch 6 horses to a cart. And she did it all against men half her age. She was in her 60s and they were in their 30s, and she beat all of these men to it. And she did it for like 10 years. And so she carried a gun. She was just like no other word for her. She was just an all around badass. And then I dabbled a little bit into some picture books, and I did a story about Bessie Stringfield, who was, I did the a talented 10th story about her. So I did a story about her as a little girl getting into a race with these boys, which was a lot of fun and great. It's a different process to do a picture book as opposed to a comic. I'm currently finishing up Tales of the Talented 10th, number 3, which is about Robert Smalls, who was he was an enslaved African who stole the Confederate warship, the USS Planter, and he sailed it through Confederate waters and turned it over to the Union. Not only did he do that, but he stole his family and a number of other people who were with him. And then he fought for the Union. He founded the South Carolina Republican Party. And like, in the most badass thing I think I've ever heard of anyone ever doing, like we all know that Oprah bought the plantation that her family was enslaved on. Well, Robert Smalls bought the plantation that he was enslaved on like 10 years after he left it. And then he let his former captor live on the plantation with him, which is just incredible. So that's what I'm finishing that book up now, which will be out in February. And I'm also currently working on the graphic novel adaptation for Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, in collaboration with Professor Dr. Ibram Kendi. And this is a page, nobody's actually seen this other than me and Ibram and a couple other people. So this is the first page of the Cotton Mather section. And my last book that just came out is, like I said, Fights. And so I'm going to read from Fights, and then you guys can ask me questions. So I'm going to go through this. And like I said, trigger warnings, there's language and very difficult situations in this next group. I hate you. I'm going to fuck you up. Chapter 3. Well, before I go into this is the part, this part of Fights is right after I found out that my father drowned. And this was my mom. And so to set it up, my mom and I are actually going on our way to the funeral. And it was just me and her and somebody else in the car, but I don't really remember it. And, but I want to say a little bit about like the disjointed nature of memoir, as opposed to like being a reporter for my life and looking and going and ask my mom and asking people. What I tried to do was remember how that situation happened and try to draw it exactly as I remembered it, and trying to make sense of it as an adult. So it's this adult Joel looking back at young Joel's life and sort of trying to putting it into context. So here we go. What happened, she said. He drowned, they said. I told that motherfucker if he just got his shit together, it would be okay. That don't make sense. He was in the army, she said. I'm sorry, they said. I know you did. I mean, fuck him, you know. Didn't he owe them boys he was with money, she said. Yeah, they said. I'm so sorry. I mean, grief washes over a person, overwhelming. Although you can throw them a line, now he's gone. You should never jump in. He's gone. They have to either use the line you throw them or swim their way out. Okay, let's go in. Okay. At 5, I guess no one thought to throw me a line. I mostly had to get myself together. But I didn't know how to swim. Hey there, Jojo. Hey, Jojo. I have very few memories of my dad. They are all scattered. You be good now, Jojo. Where do I send his Easter basket? Yeah, slurp, slurp. You want some more? This is the most vivid of all my memories. When my father drowned, he was baptized anew. The water that washed over my mother in grief also cleansed the reality of who my father really was. The air in his lungs was replaced with the virtues everyone wished he'd had. He became a saint to everyone who had ever known him. Saint Joe, whom I never really knew, but worshiped nonetheless, and learned to revere in death. Please, Mama, don't cry. Ready, aim, pow! They should have gave Joel the flag, she said. And that was that. Things went back to normal. Today we are learning our talents. Joel here is going to tap dance, right, Joel? Yes, ma'am. Clump, clump, clump. Very good. Next, we're going to draw a picture of what we want to be when we grow up, okay, boys and girls? I'm gonna be a race car driver like my daddy. I'm gonna work at home like my mama. I want to be. I don't think I'd ever had the opportunity to imagine a future. I remember thinking that kids usually want to be firemen, so I'll just do that. I was drowning. I was a sponge. At his old school, they had him reading, she said. Now all they do is busy work, she said. What's your name again? Joel. My daddy died. So, a sponge can only hold so much. I floated along like this for a few years. Good morning, class, and welcome to the 2nd grade. My name is Miss Norton. We're going to learn a lot this year. I've arranged you all in ABC order, except for Mr. Gill here. I've heard about you, so I'll put you right up here where I can keep an eye on you. I will not sleep. That's actually true. That's a true story that happened. She was evil. But every day she read to us. Okay, boys and girls, I'm going to read from a book called Tales of a 4th Grade Nothing. It's about a boy named Peter and his little brother Fudge. This was my favorite part of the day. I got my eye on you, Joel Gill. She even took us to the library. It was great. If she doesn't burn in hell, in the fires of hell, it's because she taught me to love reading. At night, the books were put away and the lights went out. Hey, you up? Things were the same. Outside, I would often join in the games that the kids played when they would let me. These kids were extraordinarily organized, but they were also very poor, so the games were very creative. Handball, hallway handball, a tennis analog, racquetball played with any blunt object and a ball, jump rope with any jump rope-like object used in an endurance contest, hanger ball, similar to basketball, played in any space, however, no dribbling required, pitching pennies, flicking your penny close to the line without ever going over it. One of the games we played, one of the games was the put-down game. We called it Jawnin', and I hated it. Strike. You trying to start a tornado? I can feel the breeze. Hey, you shut up. You shut up. Why don't you tell your mammy to shut up? Your mama, your daddy, your greasy granny with holes in her panties, she got false teeth going beep deep down Sesame Street. Ooh, his daddy dead. Look at him cry. Cry, baby, wah, wah, wah. Ha, 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 ha. Ha, ha, don't nobody care about his dead daddy. Shit. Don't you say nothing about my daddy. Ah, I'm sorry. Don't you say nothing about my daddy. He loved me. He was a great man and he loved me, and now he's dead, you shithead. He's crazy. Instead of becoming a fireman, I became the fire. And that's it. I'm trying to stop my screen share, but I can't seem to escape the screen share. There we go. All right. That was it. Thank you, guys.
It's the waving.
They're clapping.
Yeah, everybody's clapping. So now is the time for questions, and it looks like everybody's mics are on. So if you guys want to ask me any questions, you can. I'll, like, just to set up a couple of things, there was that panel where it showed me as a little kid up in water. In the first part of the book, I start off by talking about how children are like sponges, and that they soak up every single thing. And so, like, anything you leave out, they're sponges. And so I was a sponge floating in water. And so I was trying to, and so, like, that's the part of that I was trying to connect, that I was a sponge, that I was soaking up and drowning in all of the stuff that was happening at the time. So now it's time for questions.
I was talking Joel's ear off beforehand, so somebody, if you have anything you'd like to ask him, please feel free.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi. All right.
Still up there.
I grew up very poor too. Obviously, I'm white. And I liked art, but I knew it was not very practical. What made you think that you could continue with art in some form and actually support yourself?
Well, so because I teach, this is a conversation that I have all the time because I'm a professor at an art school. This is a conversation that I have all the time. And I think I know lots of journeyman illustrators and artists, people who make a living selling something. Like, they have a widget and they sell it, and they go out there and they make that thing. And I think what you have to do is you actually have to be passionate about something. So I think that when you're doing anything creative, there's two types of people. There are people who are passionate about something and people who are hustlers, right? And you all know the hustler, right? The people who jump from one thing to the next thing to the next thing, and they always got like some kind of plan or some kind of thing going. Like, I have a friend right now who is a really successful comic book writer. She's very talented. But she's always jumping from one thing to the next thing. She's making a documentary film. She's making a comic book. She's writing a comic book. She's writing a prose book. She's writing, like, everybody is doing all of these different things. So she's always hustling, but she has no passion for any of the things that she's doing. And we all know those people who are super passionate about something, but they're sitting in their studio or in their place, they're thinking to themselves, I don't know why anybody hasn't discovered me. I'm brilliant. Where's New York when you need them? And I think what you have to do, and what I learned pretty early, it wasn't so much that it was like a thing that sort of said, you can be successful as this, is that I have a passion for this thing, and I'm going to hustle until it works. and figure out different ways to work. And luckily I have an amazing, amazing wife who was supportive of that. And now it's like, it's almost, she was like, just say yes to everything, right? So like I say yes to everything, but now I've said yes to so many things I can't say yes to anything anymore. But so she was, that was the thing. It was about hustle and passion. And I will say this one thing too about, being poor and white is not is better than being poor and black. But race in this country separates the natural allies who are poor people in general. And when you take a look at what happens to poor people and when it happens to black people, yes, black poor people have it bad, but white poor people have it just as bad, but they don't know it because of race in America. They think that they're still part of this other group, and they don't connect those two things. And so I think that that's a really important thing that most people just don't understand, is that while black people have it bad, the things that hit black people also hit poor white people too, which is really, my wife is white. And there's a really interesting thing. She's got extended family that are like, I don't even know how to describe them. Like, they are like the people you see on Cops, right? Like, her extended family. Like, we just talked to them recently for the first time in like 20 years. And her former stepmother, who was an ex-con, she's a felon. She doesn't work. She's disabled. Is like a flag waving, Trump supporting, like, Trump is my guy. And once we connected for a minute on Facebook, she would send me messages back and forth, and they were always these politically charged messages. And I would try to change the conversation because I didn't want to talk to her about that. I would rather talk to her about, like, how are the kids doing and those kind of things. Until finally one morning I was just like, you understand that I am not wealthy, but I'm probably upper middle class, either, pretty affluent, and I live in New Hampshire. And so, like, the shit that's happening right now in this country is going to hit me way later than it's going to hit you. He's actually attacking you right now. So you're telling me this, and I should be the one that's like, you know what, I ain't got to worry about it. But he's like, you're on social services with like no health care, and like, you're calling for, like, this is going to hurt you worse than it's going to hurt me. So, like, those natural allies things, I think, is a really important thing. We should all be talking about that. Sorry, that was a long answer. No one's ever accused me of not being able to talk. Let me just say that right off the top.
I also liked your bit about the collection of He-Man figures.
Yes.
Yeah, we didn't have a TV when my son was little, and all his friends talked about Batman. He could talk about Batman too, just like we had a TV, but we didn't.
Yeah, so if you can see all of this there's a whole shelf back here that's filled with comics and He-Man. And I actually have, this is the original Castle Grayskull in the box. So I actually have so like, I couldn't afford it when I was a kid, but now it's way more expensive than I can afford it. So I bought it, so.
Very good. Thank you.
You're very welcome. Anybody else?
I have a question. Do you ever go into schools and do artist residencies?
No, I don't. Mostly because I'm not I'm a professor, so I teach during the school year. I've done school talks. Specifically, I talk about I do this book, or I do Strange Fruit, because those are age appropriate. Fights is not, as you could hear, because it's dealing with a lot of trauma, sexual abuse, and a lot of other things. And so I always tell people that I wrote it for kids who were like me growing up, but I think it's the kind of thing that you have a conversation with a kid if you're going to give them that book. Don't give it to a kid blind and go like, here's this book, because they're going to ask you lots of questions and you need to figure that out. Yeah. But yeah, I go into schools and talk I usually do like Black History talks and like talk about Bessie Stringfield.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
What would you recommend of your books for younger kids in school?
All of them, except for Fights.
Okay.
I mean, what author is going to tell you to just buy one, right? if we were sitting across from each other right now and I had a table full of books, I would be trying to sell you all of them. That's what I would do.
That's called the hustler in you.
That is the hustler in me. And like I said, I have four children who are still like, even though they're all adults, they're still on the family payroll at some sort, in some extent. So like, you know, like I'm still selling for them. So like Strange Fruit 1 and 2 and Tales of the Talented Tenth are books that you would read with a kid, I think, because it's not necessarily like, you know, like sex and violence kind of thing, but there's the issues about race that you might want to talk about with those books. So I would say that if you want to buy those for younger kids, read them together. Bessie Stringfield, the picture book is for like, you know, that's like a picture book. It's for like, you know, kindergarten through, you know, 4th or 5th grade. But Strange Fruit are books you can give to a kid if you have a kid who's an advanced reader, let's just give it to them. They'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
if it's a kid that struggles, you should talk with them about that.
I'd like to know how your books are available. Just in any bookstore or?
Any bookstore. And I think that they have them at the bookstore locally where you guys are now.
Yeah, they did.
Great.
I have a question.
When the apocalypse, okay, I'll get to you, but when the apocalypse is over, I'm going to come and do a book signing. So
Great. Thank you. Very informative. Very good.
So Ruby, is that right?
Yes, that's correct. It's pronounced Ruby.
Ruby.
Just
okay.
kidding. Yeah. Just kidding. So now you're in New Hampshire. Have you thought about doing any books about New Hampshire stories? Kind of an interesting state.
So Strange Fruit actually has a lot of stories from New Hampshire in it. It has the
It does.
The Noise Academy is in there. It has the story of Richard Potter.
Yep.
It also has the story of Malaga Island in Maine. So there's a few New England stories in there.
Is that the island where they kicked all the
Yes.
residents out and threw away all the dead folks in the bay and all that?
Exactly.
Yeah. That's heartbreaking. Oh,
Ruby,
Yeah.
we have it at home. Strange
we
Fruit.
do?
Both of them, yeah.
Well, I guess I better learn how to read then. Oh, no, I don't. It's pictures. You can read it to me. Yeah. Well, that's good. I'm glad because I feel like New Hampshire, we're a little state, but we have like a nice history here and
There
things
is.
happen. And
It
you
is.
know.
I live in New Boston, and I call where I live Whiteconda as opposed to Wakanda. I call it Whiteconda because I feel like I feel like New Hampshire is kind of like where white people go to be free, right? So my neighbors are great. I love my neighbors. They're all really good people. But you know, I don't like. My wife's grandfather died years ago, but her step grandmother just died this past year, and so she inherited an organ, and so we had it delivered. And the people that delivered it out of New Jersey, there were like 4 black men, like young black men, and we were outside, and I was like, "This is the most black people that's been in this town since the last time I had family up."
Yeah. How long have you lived in New Hampshire?
Since 2006, so 14
Oh, okay. Yeah, we moved up here in 93. And it has become significantly more diverse since we moved up here. And when we first came here, it just felt so plain and so flat. I mean, it's just kind of.
I moved to Manchester first, and
Yeah.
I was in Manchester for
Mhm.
probably 3 weeks before I saw another black person.
And that's actually one of the more diverse cities. You know?
I mean, where I
Yeah.
grew up, you go there, you know, like in Virginia, there are an entire like whole black neighborhoods because of segregation, right?
Right,
So
right.
like there are places where I know that I can go. Like it's like the stores were different; they carried stuff, but it's the South too. So the food, I don't know if most people don't know this about the South, but when my wife's family, when we go to like a cookout at her family, or we go to a cookout from our family, we know what we're going to get. We're going to get different recipes for fried chicken, but we're always going to get fried chicken and macaroni and cheese and collards and kinds of greens, right? If I go to a cookout here, I have no idea what I'm going to get because some of you New Englanders think that barbecue just means hot chicken, like just cook it. It's not even like flavorful. And so like it's great to go back home to the South because, you know, like that's the Southern food is like really like it's great. You can't live
Yeah.
on it. Like you can't. Like you will die if you eat it all
Yeah.
the time.
But you'll die happy.
You would definitely die happy. I mean,
In the South, barbecue is a noun, not a verb. Up here, it's a verb. So anything you cook, you know, anything you burn the hell out of, that's barbecue. And in the South, barbecue means a specific food. And it's different from what I can see. It's different from place to place.
yes, it's different. Like South Carolina has a different type of barbecue. When you get over into Texas, they don't put any sauce on it in Texas. In North Carolina, South Carolina, they do like a vinegar and mustard-based barbecue sauce, which I can make all of those things. Yeah, South Carolina barbecue is just my wife actually she went down there and we were all the whole family was on a diet. We were like, we're going to quarantine diet, right? So we were all on a diet, but we couldn't eat the barbecue. So she went down and she bought some barbecue back up that we froze that we could eat later. So barbecue and puppies and everything else.
Smart.
But yeah.
It's not just white culture though, it's Yankee culture, you know, because again, being
Yankee.
from New York, I felt like we were in a whole different country. And I also felt that I wasn't speaking the language, and I would get a lot of people say to me things like, well, you didn't need to say it like that.
Well, the thing that I found that was really interesting is that when you move above the Mason-Dixon line and you start to get into cities, like when you go down south, everybody's either black or white, right? Like you are black or white. And on Sunday, you know, at 10 o'clock, you go to church, you go to a Baptist church, and they preach fire and brimstone at you, and then you eat, and then you go home. And if you're elderly, if there's a country store or a little store down, you go and sit at the country store because you're going to have biscuits and gravy at the store. This is black or white people, right? This is the exact same thing. They just do it separately, right? But when you come above the Mason-Dixon line, you've got Haitian people, you've got Dominican people, you've got people who have Irish recipes that go back for generations. You got people who are Italian, who have Italian recipes for generations. But in the South, it's very homogenous. And a lot of what we would think about as American culture, I personally believe is Southern culture. And a lot of what Southern culture was driven by the enslaved Africans, right? Like pit barbecue was something that slaves did originally, right? So a lot of American culture, like it's funny that Black people only take up 13.3% of the population, but how much of the culture do we contribute to a country, right? If you took Black people away, like there's not a musical, the only music you guys would have left is classical music. That's the only thing that you would have left. You wouldn't have classical music. You wouldn't have fashion. There would be no blues. That means so rock would be gone. There would be like, there would be nothing left, right? It's a really interesting thing. Opera, yeah.
Danny
classical.
Boy.
Yeah.
Actually, I have a question.
I have an answer. Let's see if they match.
Have you done any works about musicians? And is that something that, okay, cool.
Well, so Harry Bucky Lou is in Strange Fruit Volume 1, he was actually a musician before he was a basketball player. And I also did an entire story about Blind Tom Wiggins. Do you know who Blind Tom was?
Please tell me.
So Blind Tom was an enslaved African who was he was an autistic savant. He couldn't see. And when he sold his mother, they threw him in for free because they thought he was going to die anyway. At about the age of 4, it became clear that he could mimic sounds. He was fascinated by sounds. He couldn't take care of himself, but he's fascinated in sounds. And when his captors, when they were in the daughter of his captor was taking piano lessons, he was listening. And he just walked Tom wasn't like any other enslaved African. He was he just wandered and did whatever he wanted, and they just had to either deal with it or not, right? Because you couldn't beat him, or you couldn't do any of those other things because he was autistic. So what didn't work? And so he goes into the room where the girl is getting her piano lesson, and he pushes her off the piano and says, "You was doing it wrong." He was 4 years old and plays it perfectly. And then once they realize, they start giving him more and more information. So he ends up touring. They called him in contract that he was performing. He was performing for the Confederacy. It's a really interesting story. It's in Strange Fruit Volume 2.
I'm so looking forward to buying a bunch of your work. I'm so excited about this. Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, I have a question.
Okay.
Are you still painting?
I don't really have time to paint anymore. It's like I'm doing this recurring series for the New Yorker called "Shit My Students Say," which is about these comics about things that happen in my classroom that my students say things about, which is ridiculous. Like when you read these comics, just so you know, everything actually happened in the comic. Like everything that happened in there actually happened. So I'm doing that. I'm doing Stamped from the Beginning. I don't know if you've read Stamped from the Beginning. If anybody read it, you should read it. But it's 529 pages. I have to turn that into 250 pages of comics. Mm-hmm. And so like I am on my 7th or like I think I'm on my 10th reading of the first half of the book where I'm reading and taking notes and writing. So just to get through the first half of it, and I have to have 125 pages penciled by December. I'm also working on a deadline for another book that has to be done by the end of the month. So I'm doing that. So I don't really have time to paint anymore. I just do like little watercolors in my sketchbook sometimes, but not much oil painting. And I teach oil painting. So I do demonstrations sometimes, but not very much anything else.
Oh, well, okay. I just wanted to say I really liked what you did show.
Well, thank you.
Me too. I think your paintings of your family are gorgeous.
Thank you. They're hanging up all over my house. I could never sell anything. I could never get anybody to pay attention. I had like one small interest from a gallery in New York, but as soon as I started drawing comics about Black history, the New York Times was writing about my stuff. So I was like, this is probably where I should spend the time.
I have a question about in your book when you wrote, "I'm not going to be a firefighter and the fire." The fire's in you. What did you really mean by that?
So,
artistic fire?
So in that book, so over the course of the entire book, there's a couple of like metaphors that keep coming up. Fire and water keep coming up a lot. Water because it was a perfect metaphor for like how kids react to what's going on in the world around them, like being sponges and soaking things up. But also my father drowned when I was 5. So like there's that and me drowning in all of those things as well. And when I was in that memory about like watching kids around me and saying, kids just like think they're gonna like, I remember this exact memory. Kids say they want to be firefighters. So I'll just be a firefighter. That's what I'll write. Cause I had never thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up. I had gone through so many different things by 5. Like I was just like, I had not thought about what I wanted to be when I grew up.
Oh.
And so when you see how angry I become at the end of that chapter, I'm saying instead of becoming a fireman, I became the fire. Because when you're a fire, you burn, right? And you burn indiscriminately. And so for the next part of that book, I'm just angry and like, and so when I originally started writing the book, I thought about it in terms of like myself as the victim. Like I was sexually abused, I was emotionally abused, I had all these different things that had happened. And I thought about myself as a victim. And then these kids, they're all adults, grown adults like me, right? They decided to have this like cookout back in Franklin County, Virginia, that was like a reunion of all these kids that grew up between a certain time in the same projects. And they all like, a lot of these kids are really successful, which is really amazing to me. But there was this one kid and I walked by him and his name was Carlos. And his name is Carlos. And I remember him distinctly because he had a little brother who died while we were there. Like while we were in the projects, his brother fell off the balcony. And then he broke both of his legs and then he got pneumonia and he died. He was like 7. And so I remember Carlos really distinctly. And Carlos, who's like, I'm 6 feet tall. Carlos is like 6'3", and he's probably got, 50 pounds, like a big dude. And he was like, I used to have nightmares about you when I was a kid. He was like, I wouldn't go outside if I thought you were outside. Like, he was like terrified of me. And so I had to reevaluate myself and look at like how I was, and then realizing that, like, because every chapter in Fights is about a fight I got into as a kid. And so every chapter, that when you see that I'm fighting, when I'm just being the fire, like that doesn't happen in a vacuum with kids, right? You all know that kids they can't communicate in the same way that we can. We can't go and say, you know, my father died last week, and the only thing people are telling me is like, go back to normal. Like, kids don't know how to say that, right? It's just that they're angry. And so that's what was happening. I was angry, and that was the way it came out. It just came out as me being like a holy terror. And so I say in the book that I write this book because I wrote this book because I wanted kids who were like me to see that it's possible to be a little different, because I make choices along the way that are a little different each time. Like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to be this person. I'm not going to be that person. And then I wrote it for adults. So like, children's literature is kind of like a window. You know, you've got the window view. There's like this theory about children's literature, right? Like, there's windows, and then there's mirrors. And mirrors, when you look at it and you see yourself, and window is when you look at it and you see something different. And what for fights, I believe for me, and I've heard people say this about fights is a mirror and a window. I made it for people who are dealing with that, and I made it for people who can look in and see what that's like. I just brought everybody down.
No.
Any more questions? These are good questions.
Am I on? I can't tell.
Yes.
We
Okay.
can hear you.
You look like you're about to give me a mission that I can either accept or decline, and then this self-destruct, but you are there. I can.
Okay. I just wanted to thank you for sharing all of this information that I don't think many of us are aware of. But once we buy all your books, we will be.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask you, did you end up going through therapy to help work yourself through?
Oh, yeah. That's why I can talk about this stuff. I mean, you know, people, like I wrote about when I write in fights that fights was not cathartic, because that I'd already been through the catharsis part, like going through therapy for years. And I personally 100% believe, whether you have trauma in your life or not, that you should spend time in therapy. I just think you should, like, just to be a good person. I think it's going to be something that'll help you. But I didn't write this. The only thing that I cried about when writing fights was like, it was like a slog for a while. It was like this terrible thing, this terrible thing, this terrible thing. I can't believe it. And then I was like, you know what? It wasn't all bad. Like, I had fun as a kid. I remember fun times. And so I started writing about, I put this story in there about this man named Mr. Charles, whose family, so my grandparents were really wealthy in the South, because my grandfather lost a leg in a mine in West Virginia in the 1920s or 30s. And they gave him a big settlement of $500. And he used that money. He was a hustler. He used that money and like gambled and like trading and like all this stuff. And he bought 300 acres of land and started a dairy farm in rural Southwestern Virginia. I mean, he was so wealthy in the 50s and 60s. He was born in 1900. So in the 50s and 60s, they didn't make him go on the backs of stores in the South because he was so wealthy. They didn't call him boy. They didn't call him Mr. Arrington, but they called him Uncle Robert as opposed to Mr. Arrington. And everybody knew him as Uncle Robert, and my grandmother as Aunt Thalia. But his farm, the farm that I spent some time on, was a defunct farm by the time I got there, because he had died in a burner explosion in 1962. And Mr. Charles's family's farm was right next to it, and it wasn't as big. And they were just like a black family who had a little small acre. My grandfather had all like this massive estate, right? And so and there was a church, a primitive Baptist church that we went to that was in between the two properties. And so I used to catch the bus at the church. So I would go up and I was staying with family at the time. And the family members were really, really abusive. My mother was taking care of my grandmother, who was an invalid at the time. They were abusive to her too, but that's a completely different story. And so I would get up in the morning, and I would go to the bus stop. And Mr. Charles's farm was right next to to next there, and he would ask me to help him do stuff, like just randomly, like help me get these cows across the road, hold these doors while I pull the tractors out. And one morning he was feeding a calf that for some reason the mother wasn't feeding it. And I remember playing with the calf. And then after that, for like a few weeks, he just left the bottle for me to do it in the morning when I would get up. I would get up there early and I would feed this calf every morning. He would just leave this bottle out. And I remember thinking when I was a kid, like, Mr. Charles, he's so nice, right? He's such a nice guy, right? And then the thing that made me cry about it was realizing that Mr. Charles wasn't nice. He was just normal. This is what you do for kids, right? Like any normal person would see a kid and be like, oh, that kid probably wants something to do. Let me like give him some chores to do that are fun, that he, you know what I mean? Like that's what normal people do with kids. And that was like a thing because I had met so few adults in my life that were just like normal people, that any sort of like human connection I thought was like charity. Like this is like the best thing ever. So that was like the only thing that I cried about during the process of that. So.
Wonderful.
So anything else?
No, hopefully.
Well, thank you guys.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I did have one last question. I'm sorry. I was trying to get my audio to work.
No, it's fine.
No, okay. Yeah. So this is Ruby again, by the way, the big R. So how far ahead?
You know, there's a rapper that they call the R. His name's
It's
Rocky.
me. It's me, actually. Yes. Yeah. This is my alter ego here. So this is a self-serving question, and I can understand if you want to kind of be hedging on this a bit. But so how far ahead time-wise are you committed with stories, let's say? Like when do you think you might be looking for a new story?
So I have another volume of Tales of the Talented Tenth. I mean, of Strange Fruit to do after Stamped is done. So Stamped, I'm finishing this like the next 2 years. I'll be working on Stamped, and then 18 months after that, I'll be working on Strange Fruit Volume 3. And so at that point, I mean, I don't have it. So like, here's the thing about publishing, and it's like, this is a thing that happens if you're easy to work with, and you can do things relatively quickly, then it becomes a thing that you have to be careful about. You saying that you want to do something because people will like, let's publish it. So my agent, who is amazing, she's actually stuck in Taiwan right now. Her husband was over there on like a trip. Oops. And so in February, she went over there and she's stuck. She's been there since late February with her kids, but she's great. If I mention something to her, then she's going to spend the next like 6 weeks asking me to put together a proposal so that she can sell it, right? And when you get to a place where you're in publishing, where people, like, you know, a couple of editors, you know, a couple of the gatekeepers, they have ideas for things, they'll bring them to you and say, are you interested in doing this? And it's not always the best or the, you know, the greatest. It's like the really good and the easy to work with. And without like tooting my own horn, I'm really good and easy to work with. So people come to me all the time. So, and I have some ideas about some other stuff, some things that I want to do after Strange Fruit Volume 3 and Stamped coming out. But I'm kind of holding off on any of those things because Stamped is going to be a big book. As we've seen now, it's like both of his books, Stamped from the beginning, Stamped the YA version, and How to Be an Anti-Racist are all New York Times and international bestsellers. And this book went through a bidding war between publishers trying to get it. So like I'm expecting this book to be really big. So I don't know what's going to happen after that. So I'm like holding off. I don't know what's going to happen.
That's a good problem to have, though, isn't it?
It is. It is definitely. It is definitely a first world problem, and I 100%. You know, I feel like this is like I am really lucky, and I'm not complaining at all.
Do you think you might quit teaching?
No, I love teaching.
No,
Teaching is great. I love teaching. I mean, as an artist, you just like, because if I'm not talking to people, instead of sitting like this, I am turned just like this and I'm drawing. This is where my tablet is. This is what I do, right? I'm like sitting here and I'm drawing. Or I go upstairs and I sit upstairs outside in the house and I draw on my iPad. Like I draw all the time.
Yeah.
And so you need something else outside of you. And so being outside, like teaching, and I teach comics and I teach drawing and painting and some art history. And so like being somebody who can teach some things and like have those conversations is rewarding in a different way.
Yeah. Thank you.
I think that's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Yay!
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye,
Yeah,
Moms.
that's some great questions.
Hey, Ruby.
Hey, how you doing?
All
Good.
right. Come back in 2 weeks.
Bye,
Okay.
everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good luck, Jill.
Thank you.
Yeah, good luck. I'll read all your books when I learn to
That's
read.
what I'm hoping. Write reviews.
Yes.
Even
Yeah,
if you
you
don't
bet.
buy them from Amazon, write a review on Amazon. Help sales.
Oh,
I really
Okay.
wish you could come.
Help sales, and then also like request the books at your local library because that also helps sales as well.
well, we got a local bookstore in Warner, so we can request them there.
You
And
can
then,
request them there and request them.
and
No, even when you buy a book, you want to help an author, call the library and request it at the library as well.
Yep.
Because there'll
Okay.
be new purchases you can have them make.
Good idea.
Okay, good. I'll do that.
So
All right.
Joel, I need your address
Oh, okay.
so that I can mail you a check.
Ooh,
I
that
usually
sounds like
have
a
it
good
with
deal.
me.
I will send it to you.
Great, cool.
Brian.
I wish Joel could come speak
Hedrick.
at the Kearsarge Middle School and the high school too. You'd be
I've
great.
spoken at high schools and middle schools, so I have actually done that.
Yep.
So I sent you my
Yep,
address.
I got it. Cool. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to end the meeting now.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank
Stay
you very
well.
much.